Senator Joe Manchin is pushing for a new requirement that calls for parents to work in order to receive the child care tax credit, or the child tax credit, that is. Manchin made his case by saying, quote, tax credits are based around people that have tax liabilities. I'm even willing to go as long as they have a W-2 and show they're working. The West Virginia senator has been met with opposition from Democratic Party leaders, including Senators Bernie Sanders and Sherrod Brown, as well as Washington State Congresswoman Susan Delbene, who told Insider that adding a work requirement or other stipulations to the child tax credit would hurt middle-class families. Former press secretary for the Sanders campaign and host of the Bad Faith podcast, Briahna Joy Gray, joins us to discuss. Briahna, welcome.
Thank you.
And so what's interesting to me about these Manchin comments is it raises the question of whether the kind of the neoliberal Reagan era policies of the last 40 years have actually ended and we're entering a new era of politics, or whether there just happened to be a window open to sneak some good stuff through in the midst of the pandemic, and the window is now rapidly closing, raising the question of whether or not Democrats are going to be able to slip everything through before that window closes and returns us to the previous era. And so the question is really, I think, does Manchin have support for this pushback? Or is he isolated and will get steamrolled? What's your sense of where we are at this crossroads?
Well, of course, there was a lot of crowing in the period of time after each of the COVID relief bills were passed about the extent to which that Biden was really stepping up to the political moment that COVID crisis demanded, that he was the new FDR, and that this was, as you put it, Ryan, a new era for spending, where some of the concerns about deficit hawkery were out the window, and Americans understood and felt really viscerally in their pocketbooks for the first time in a long time exactly what the government could do for them in a moment of turmoil. But what you're seeing right now is that window is in fact short-lived, and we're not going to get the kind of revolutionary push towards social democracy in a moment like this without, I think, a more concerted understanding of what we need from more radical leadership than Joe Biden or the rest of these corporate Democrats really present. And I think a lot of progressives were skeptical, as there was all of this crowing earlier this year about cutting child poverty in half. We're going to cut child poverty in half and we're going to make it permanent. And I certainly hope it manages to be at least more permanent than it is currently slated to expire to be, right? But the reality is you still have a lot of these folks who really, I think, see the potential, the longer term political potential of the population having a few less constraints than they have historically been operating under. And one of the most radical parts, one of the most progressive, the most transformative parts of this child tax credit is the fact that people who earn so little money that they don't actually file taxes have been able to benefit. And that includes about half of Black and brown children. And that is a population that's really set to be punished by these kinds of work requirements that Manchin's talking about right now.
Oh, how much of this do you think is just talk from Joe Manchin, and how much do you think he'll actually be able to execute on? You know, he said during the original February $1.9 trillion package, he's like, there's absolutely no way I'm doing this. Forget it. And people are like, well, the Manchin says forget it. You only have 50 Democrats. I guess this is over. And of course, it just turned out to be Manchin generating headlines for himself back in West Virginia. He got some scraps around unemployment insurance and then ended up voting for it. Do you think this is him generating headlines, or do you think that he has the weight of kind of enough of the party behind him that he can extract something serious here?
Well, it's certainly always him generating headlines, but it's not just Joe Manchin, right? We had Jim Clyburn hopping on TV recently to say that $3.5 trillion is only a ceiling, and saying that we could negotiate down from there by $1 trillion or so, right? Not exactly the negotiating position you would want from someone who's heralded as a stalwart guardian of civil rights in the Democratic Party, especially given the extreme consequences of cutting these child tax credits will have on the population that Jim Clyburn purports to be fighting for in Congress, right? So, I think that it's important to realize that there's a little bit of rotating villain syndrome going on here, where Manchin is a convenient pariah sometimes, but if he were to capitulate, it would be somebody else. And without, I think, a more forceful movement pushing for these kinds of policies, there are all too many corporate Democrats that are all too happy to capitulate and blame funding on an issue when there are plenty of funding. If you wanted to tax and spend, which again isn't necessary, you can have Stephanie Kelton on to talk about that. But if you really did want to include more meaningful pay-fors, there are a lot of things you could do, including closing the tax gap, which could fund up to $1 trillion more a year simply by enforcing existing tax laws. Things that the millionaires in Congress tend to shy away from.
I guess if I'm to play devil's advocate, try to steel man the position he's taking, why shouldn't people who are going to get this benefit be at least, he said you didn't even have to, it's not that you have to be working, but you have to be kind of open to exploring the possibility of working. And I don't know, are progressives saying, nope, absolutely not. We won't do that.
Well, the people receiving this benefit are children, so I'm not sure that we want to open the door back up to child labor laws. If the point of this tax credit is that we want children not to be starving, remember that 50% of people who receive these checks said it made an enormous difference in their life. In Joe Manchin's own district, his own state, which is one of the poorest, if not the poorest in the union, I always forget they go neck and neck with Mississippi. It's had a significant impact on reducing child hunger. If the point of this is to say that vulnerable children in our country who have no say in the economic straits that they're living in should be lifted to a certain degree of living standard, then whether or not their parents are meritorious is really not a part of this equation. If this is in fact about a coercive mechanism to punish parents, then you should go ahead and say that, but stop pretending that it's about the children, that you have any investment in what one of the most vulnerable constituencies in this country are living like.
Yeah, and in fact, the West Virginia Center on Budget and Policy found that in Manchin's home state, the rate of food insecurity dropped following this child tax credit payment. And the data shows that West Virginians spent their CTC payments largely on food, followed by household essentials like utilities and also clothing and paying down debt. So there really is something to that. People are using this money not to go and buy luxury goods, but they're buying these things to pay their bills. And that seems to be lost in this. But another thing that seems to be lost with Joe Manchin's call that people need to be working is, what about the stay-at-home parent aspect of this? So is he going to require in two-parent households that it's just one person has to have a job? Will he say no? And if it's only one, then your tax credit is now cut in half. If you both have to be working, so your children have to go to daycare and you can't have the option of a stay-at-home parent, it almost makes me wonder if this could be a battle cry even to appeal to conservatives, right? To say, well, look what Joe Manchin's going to do.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because I've actually noticed that some, maybe not this bill in particular, but I've seen support for the idea, at least, of a child tax credit from right-leaning think tank and policy people, because they see it as a pro-family measure. Do you see that, Briahna?
Right. Well, the top 10 states where families are receiving this benefit are all conservative Trump voting states with Republican governors, including states like Utah, right, where there's also a tendency to have more children in the household. So, and on top of that, keep in mind that 58% of people polled said they were more likely to vote for a politician that wanted to uphold and maintain these child tax credits, right? So there's real political benefits, not just among Democratic voters in blue states, but in red states among Republican voters, too. I think that's part of why there's a little bit of nervousness about how permanent these things end up being, because there's a real push to make them permanent, not just extended for the next 4 or 5 years or so, as is in the current bill.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because as we know, conservatives do have more children than liberals do. Like, that's statistically a fact. They have children earlier, and they have more. So as a result, they'll actually be getting a bunch more money from this policy than liberals would. Next on Rising, journalist for Haiti Liberté, Kim Ives, joins us to break down new reports that a prosecutor has moved to charge the Haitian prime minister with orchestrating the assassination of the country's president. Next on Rising.